Let me tell you, this month's big money buys list is crazy. There is some crazy stuff that is happening that you don't want to miss. Stay tuned for the video. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, we are going to run down the top 10 big money buys for eBay for the month of March. And let me tell you, this is an interesting list. There's a lot of crazy stuff that is happening, but one of the first things that I want to highlight for you is that we are seeing an incredible increase in the values associated with the comics that are on this list. And honestly, we could probably say that about collectibles in general. But when you look at the dollar amounts of the books that were sold in March, it is head and shoulders above what we saw on the February list. So that's just something that off the top I wanted to make mention of. Another thing that we noticed is that every single book on this list, by and large, is associated with either the X-Men or Amazing Spider-Man, with one exception. And you'll see what that exception is in just a couple of moments. The number one book on this list has a massive asterisk next to it. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight for you is that there are some interesting things that are happening with the three big grading companies as it relates to this list. We see books from CGC, CBCS, and also PGX on this list. And as I go through the books on the list, you're going to see some really interesting things happening where the market is valuing certain books from certain grading companies very differently from one another. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the crazy stuff that you are going to see on this list. And I definitely want to encourage you to stay tuned until the end because we have a bonus book that we've thrown in the mix. With that said, let's get to the list. Number 10 on the list is Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man. This book sold for $32,100 as part of an auction with a total of 63 bids on March 6th of this year. This was a CBCS 4.5 with cream to off-white pages. I should also mention that this book was actually signed by Stan Lee on the back cover, and it is also just one of several copies of Amazing Fantasy 15 that we see on this month's list. Number 9 on the list is X-Men issue number 1, and this is the first appearance of the X-Men, Professor X, and also Magneto. And this book is on fire as people are anticipating the X-Men and mutants coming into the MCU, and that is why this book is actually showing up on the list. This specific copy was a CGC 5.5 with off-white to white pages that was sold as a buy it now on eBay for $32,500 on March 23rd. Currently, Go Collect has an FMV for this book at $14,500, which is really a reflection of how dynamic the market is right now. Books are going for crazy amounts of money, and we aren't necessarily seeing those values being reflected in the FMV in the Go Collect system. And so this is why it's important to make sure that you actually look at the sales data contained within Go Collect to see when the most recent sale was, but then you could also supplement with eBay as well, just to get a feel for how the market is actually moving. At present, there are 181 Blue Label 5.5s on the CGC census. There are also roughly 700 Blue Labels that are graded higher than a 5.5 on the census. I definitely want to encourage you to stay tuned because the number 7 book on the list will make for a very interesting comparison to this CGC 5.5 copy that we just spoke about. Number 8 on the list is another copy of X-Men issue number 1, and this book sold as a buy it now for roughly $34,000 on March 28th. This CGC 6.0 with cream to off-white pages was also a signature series book that was signed by Stan Lee. At present, there are 23 total signed copies of this book on the census at a 6.0, with an additional 41 copies that are signed graded above a 6.0. In total, there are 5,192 copies of X-Men issue number 1 on the CGC census. So as I alluded to earlier in this video, number 7 on the list is an interesting book. And it's interesting not because it's an X-Men issue number 1, but because it is actually a PGX 7.5. A PGX 7.5 on the list that sold for $34,500 on March 20th. This book with off-white to white pages sold for only $2,000 more than the CGC 5.5 that we spoke about a few moments ago. And this potentially says a lot about how the market actually values CGC books versus PGX. The big question here is whether the new owner of this PGX book is going to take a shot on goal by sending that book into CGC to potentially have it cracked, clean, pressed, and regraded. It's a little bit of a gamble to know which way the ball is going to bounce, but it might be worthwhile for them to actually send it in and see if this book can come back at a 7.5 from CGC, because that would be huge for the value of this book. Number 6 on the list is a really awesome book, not just because it's Giant Size X-Men number 1, but because it is a 9.8 specifically from CBCS. This book sold for roughly $35,000 on March 8th. Now, what's really fascinating is that this book went for roughly $13,000 more than the current FMV and most recent sale in the Go Collect database. That book happened to be a CGC book, and it's going to be very interesting to see if another CGC 9.8 of Giant Size X-Men actually comes onto the market, and whether that copy will go for more than the CBCS book. Now, when you dig into the data, what you'll actually see is that there are roughly 203 copies of a CGC 9.8 Giant Size X-Men out there. So there is potential for this to actually happen, and maybe we will see it on a future list. Number 5 on the list is Incredible Hulk issue number 1. And this is the only non-X-Men Spider-Man book to actually make it to the list. This copy was a CGC 6.0 blue label that sold for $35,601 in an auction. There were a total of 119 total bids for this comic on March 8th. For those that aren't aware, this book, Incredible Hulk issue number 1, is actually the origin and first appearance of the Incredible Hulk, a really awesome book that I hope to have in my collection at some point. At present, there are 41 Blue Label 6.0 copies in the CGC census and 170 total Blue Label copies that are graded a 6.0 or higher. So a lot of nice books out there that are floating around that have the potential to maybe show up on our list in the months ahead. Number 4 on the list is another copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, and this book was a CGC 4.0 with cream to off-white pages that sold for $39,500 on March 21st as a full price offer. Number 3 on the list is another copy of Amazing Fantasy 15. This specific book sold as a make-an offer for $42,000 on March 10th. This CGC 4.5 blue label had off-white to white pages. Now, what's really interesting about this transaction is that this book sold for roughly $10,000 more than the number 10 book on the list at the same grade. The major difference between these two books is that this copy had white pages versus the other book that was actually signed by Stan Lee but graded by CBCS. Down in the comment section, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are as to why these two books went for dramatically different prices just a few days apart. Again, you had one that was signed by Stan Lee, but another that had white pages that actually went for a lot more money. So I'm going to be curious to hear what your thoughts are on these two transactions. Number 2 on the list sold for $59,000. And yes, it was another copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man. This book actually went for full asking price on March 3rd. It was a CGC restored purple label graded at an 8.5 with cream to off-white pages. When you take a look at the label, what we see is that this book had moderate restoration, which included color touch, pieces added, tears sealed, and was also cleaned. And the number 1 book on the list was a lot. Yes, it was a lot of money, but it was also a lot of comics. It was literally issues 1 through 544 of the Uncanny X-Men. This lot of comics sold for $89,500 as a buy it now on March 24th. This lot included 50 CGC copies of all key comics. Issue number 1, for example, was a CGC 2.5. There were several different copies of Signature Series books signed by Stan Lee, Chris Claremont, Neil Adams, Roy Thomas, Jim Steranko, and so many more. And the other thing that I'll highlight is the buyer paid basically $90,000 for these books, and then also paid another $1,000 to have the books shipped. It's a lot of money. So in this video, we tend to focus on big money buys from eBay. But as many people out there know, there are other marketplaces in which you can actually buy comics. One of them is Heritage. And we actually went back to the beginning of the year for our bonus spotlight book. And a lot of people probably know which book I'm actually about to talk about. For others, it will be a little bit of a surprise. But earlier this year, in January, there was a copy of Batman issue number 1 that sold for $2.2 million on Heritage. And this is actually a little bit of a bargain. And I say that because the seller was asking for $3.3 million, but settled for $2.2. It's a lot of money, but what's really awesome is that this is the only copy of a 9.4 Batman issue number 1 on the CGC census. It is also the highest graded copy of this book known to exist. So with that, we are going to wrap up this countdown. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, I certainly want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment behind. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I definitely want to encourage you to do that right now because we release a lot of awesome content here. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.